People who knew Darren Russell and his youth found it hard to believe that he managed to become a doctor. There weren't any doctors in Darren's family, so his desire to go to medical school seemed strange, at the very least. In the depths of his soul, even Darren himself couldn't really understand why he wanted to become a doctor so badly. At first, the young man was determined to become a surgeon, a hero in a white coat saving people's lives. But when Darren started med school, he surprised everyone when he realized that he actually wanted to specialize in gynecology. The truth was that this branch of medicine was just as important as all the others. Darren was a good student, and by the time he graduated from the university, there was only one issue that worried him. Where exactly was he going to work after he got his diploma? Since the young doctor came from a small town in southern Iowa, he didn't even hope to get a job in the big city. Of course, pretty much every young doctor dreams of working in New York, where the best medical institutions in the country are located. Unfortunately, only the best and best-connected doctors can get a position there, and Darren didn't fit the criteria. Although he did have one option he could explore if he really wanted to. The fact was that Darren had a rather influential friend, Simon Morgan, whose father was the head physician at one of the best hospitals in New York. Of course, it would be an exaggeration to say that they two were close friends. They did consider themselves to be friendly, but nothing more. Nevertheless, Simon advised Darren to move to New York on numerous occasions. He did it mostly because Simon's sister, Linda, was crazy about Darren. In the depths of his soul, the young man understood that if he were to choose to move to New York, he would have to date Linda, whom he didn't really like. At the same time, she was very pretty and took care of herself. But the young woman's upbringing and her take on life weren't exactly the kind Darren was looking for in his girlfriend. Linda grew up in a wealthy family where she was the youngest daughter, which meant that she was pretty much allowed to do whatever she wanted. That included buying expensive cars, going to beauty salons, having dinners in restaurants, and endless clubbing, and that was far from the complete list of her entertainment. Linda didn't work anywhere and simply lived off her parents' money, and that wasn't the kind of life Darren was looking for. Least of all, he wanted to feel trapped in a golden cage. Simon simply laughed at his friend's worries, as he saw them as outright stupidity. Losing out on such a great opportunity because of one's ambition seemed rather foolish. Look, you have to understand that all you can get on your own is some job in some godforsaken place where you'll have to work 16-hour days without ever getting any time off, Simon said. Darren only smiled in response, saying that everything that happens is God's will. But Simon's words turned out to be more prophetic. A week after that memorable conversation, Darren was sent to a small provincial town that was even smaller than the one he used to live in. Of course, having to work in such a place was very disappointing to the young doctor. The hospital that Darren was supposed to work at looked rather nice, although it didn't have any modern equipment. Nevertheless, Darren's mother was right when she told him that it was this kind of hospital that new doctors could get the most experience. The young man worked in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and therefore he always had a lot of work. At first, Darren worked under the supervision of an experienced physician, David Thompson, but then he was allowed to take on more and more responsibility and even started treating patients on his own. It was then that Darren met a young nurse named Sandy Hughes. Like Darren, she had recently moved to the city. She came from Oklahoma. Since the young people had a lot to talk about, they quickly became friends. Of course, when they just met, neither of them thought about anything serious. However, they did feel something that made them hope that their friendship could eventually develop into something more. The situation was complicated by the fact that Sandy actually already had a boyfriend. He was a local man who worked on a farm. Sandy didn't see their relationship as anything serious and wasn't planning on building a life with this man. Peter only had a high school diploma, and unfortunately, Sandy simply didn't have much to talk about with him. That's not to say that Peter was a bad man. They simply weren't a good match, mostly because of their different backgrounds. Deep down, Sandy really liked Darren, whom she saw as an example of a perfect man. Meanwhile, Darren himself tried not to focus on starting any kind of relationship. First and foremost, he wanted to get a promotion and move to the big city. Therefore, his encounters with Sandy were of purely friendly nature and weren't aimed at anything other than that. Darren had been working at the hospital for 6 months when Sandy invited him to her birthday party. "Well, I don't know what about Peter," Darren hesitated. "Peter won't be there. He's busy on the farm, so he would only be able to come celebrate late in the evening," Sandy answered with a smile. At that moment, Darren couldn't really understand why it was so easy for him to accept Sandy's invitation. Since the young doctor had the day off that day, he went to see Sandy at about noon. Darren handed the birthday girl a bouquet of roses, hugged her, and wished her a happy birthday. To his sincere surprise, the young man saw that there was no one else in the house. "Where are the rest of the guests?" Darren thought to himself. It's hard to pinpoint the moment when the young people realized that they wanted to be together. Perhaps it had something to do with the wine glass that Darren had, or maybe it was just the atmosphere, which was rather intimate. But the fact remained that day, Darren inadvertently crossed the line which he had no intention of crossing. It was like a temporary insanity caused by an unbridled passion that both of them felt at the same time. Lying in bed, Sandy noticed a large birthmark the size of an apple on Darren's chest. "That's a rather distinctive feature you have. They say that such marks bring good luck," Sandy noted with a smile. Darren smiled and kissed the woman. The young people only came to their senses in the evening when Darren had to leave. The young man felt rather uncomfortable and tried to avoid Sandy's eyes. Darren felt that he had done very wrong by her boyfriend, who had to work on the farm at the time. He was very uncomfortable with the fact that everyone considered Sandy to be Peter's fiancée. Of course, Sandy wasn't planning on marrying Peter, but for some reason, everyone around thought that their wedding was inevitable. Darren left Sandy's house feeling disgusted with himself. The young man felt like a cheater who did something very, very bad. At that moment, Darren had no idea that 3 pairs of very attentive eyes were already following him. Since the young doctor was returning home at dusk, he didn't notice the 3 men who were coming at him from behind. Darren didn't even have time to turn around, as he immediately received a strong blow to the head. Having fallen on the dusty pavement, the young doctor immediately found himself under a hail of blows which the 3 men generously showered him with. One of them, no surprise there, was Peter. He had long been jealous of Sandy and Darren and therefore was just waiting for the right opportunity to get the young doctor. And now he had such an opportunity. If it weren't for the intervention of a resident from one of the houses located nearby, Darren would have probably gotten it even worse. But when the 3 attackers heard the angry scream from the old farmer, they backed off and ran away. None of them wanted to get involved with the police and even more so to risk ending up in prison over Peter's jealousy. Darren barely managed to get up on his feet and tried to wipe the blood off his face. Staggering from side to side, he reached his house, where he collapsed on the bed without even undressing. The next day, he glanced in the mirror and recoiled instinctively. His face was swollen and looked rather terrifying. Moreover, Darren had one tooth loose, which meant that he needed to go see a dentist as soon as possible. Of course, the young man realized that the attack had something to do with Peter, who must have found out about the time he spent with Sandy. Nevertheless, Peter had no right to attack Darren, especially since it was entirely his wife Sandy's fault. Being a hot-tempered small-town farmer, the man only knew one way to deal with his problems: by exercising force, believing that that was the only way to defend his honor. After all that had happened, Darren didn't want to stay in the city. Moreover, Simon had called him and said that his father had a position ready for him at his hospital in New York. Such a position would definitely open new possibilities for Darren. It just so happened that Darren left without even saying goodbye to Sandy, who apparently had a serious conversation with Peter. Darren himself didn't see it as running away, although he did feel that he wasn't doing the right thing. As it turned out a little later, Harold Morgan really did have a job ready for him in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Of course, the head physician immediately noticed the skillfully covered bruises on the young man's face. But he chose not to talk about it and immediately started bringing his colleague up to speed. At that time, Darren didn't yet realize that Harold Morgan had his own plans for him. Due to his youth, Darren didn't really think ahead, and therefore he couldn't see Dr. Morgan's ulterior motives. But the truth was that Harold had his own goals, which were very different from those of Darren. First of all, he wanted Darren to marry his daughter, Linda. Harold's plan was rather simple. The man had grown quite tired of his daughter's antics, and therefore he simply wanted to get rid of her as soon as possible. To do this, he started inviting Darren over for dinners at his house more and more often, while Linda was always there waiting for the young doctor and giving him all kinds of attention. Of course, Darren felt uncomfortable that he now owed Harold Morgan a career at the local hospital. That was probably the reason why he accepted the head physician's proposal. The most surprising thing, however, was that he never once spoke to Sandy in all that time. The wedding of Darren and Linda was so grand that it shocked all the guests. Unfortunately, Darren didn't actually love Linda, so it was more of a marriage of convenience than a union based on mutual love and respect. Darren felt that he was indebted to Harold Morgan for giving him his job, and therefore he considered his marriage to the man's daughter a repayment of his debt. At first, life with Linda seemed like a fairy tale. Their family was never in need of money, which they could spend left and right at their heart's desire. But then Linda seemed to have taken off her mask and showed her true face. She was an obnoxious, spoiled woman who spent all of her free time in restaurants and nightclubs, alternating them with trips to beauty salons and high-end boutiques. Of course, Darren tried to reason with his wife, but that was nearly impossible to do. On top of that, Harold Morgan was pretty blunt about it. "I won't let anyone hurt my daughter, even if she's wrong. Get it through your head, or I'll quickly send you back to that swamp I pulled you out of," the man said, hitting the table with his fist. Darren blushed deeply and turned to face the wall. It cost him a lot of effort to restrain himself and refrain from standing up to the head physician and speaking his mind. Harold Morgan wasn't only Darren's father-in-law, but also his immediate superior, who was pretty much responsible for the fate of each of the hospital's employees. Darren endured ridicule and humiliation for over a decade. Not a day went by that he didn't curse the day that he accepted Simon's offer and moved to New York. Now he would have gladly gone back to the very wilderness that Harold called a swamp. Everything seemed clear and simple there, while he still remained a stranger in the big city. Moreover, he was still seen as the head physician's golden boy at the hospital. Once, when Linda came home from yet another party well after midnight, Darren couldn't stand it and started a fight. They didn't have children because Linda didn't want them. The woman wanted to live for herself, and the way she saw it, kiddos would get in the way of her freedom and prevent her from doing whatever she wanted. Darren and Linda had fights before, but that one was especially heated. "If there's something you don't like, feel free to get out of my house," Linda screamed. Perhaps those were exactly the words Darren wanted to hear at that moment. Having packed up his things, the young doctor went out into the night and slammed the door behind him. Darren understood perfectly well that he crossed the line and that he could now forget about his job at the hospital. He knew that at the behest of Harold Morgan, he'd be fired the very next morning. On the other hand, Darren got the very freedom that he'd been dreaming of all this time. Several years passed, and during this time, Darren achieved success in his hometown and was considered one of the best specialists in his field. By the time he turned 45, Darren still hadn't gotten married, but he still considered marriage to Linda a huge mistake. It was rumored that Linda had gotten married 3 more times and that each of her marriages ended up in divorce because none of the men could endure Linda's attitude. Darren thought about Sandy once in a while, but he never found the time to pay her a visit. 20 years had passed since they last saw each other, and therefore Darren didn't know how Sandy's life had changed over the years. She probably married Peter after all. That man knew how to get what he wanted, Darren thought sadly. That day, he was supposed to go to a medical forum on issues associated with the introduction of innovative technologies in medicine. Since Darren didn't like flying since childhood, he took a train to his destination. The man liked to look out the window and follow the endless fields that stretched for many miles along the state line. When he was boarding the train, Darren noticed a pregnant young woman of about 20. The size of her belly made it clear to the experienced doctor that her due date was coming up. Well, that doesn't seem like the best idea on her part, being so far along. She should be staying home close to the hospital, Darren thought to himself, but then he calmed down, having decided that the woman could make her own decisions and knew what was best for her. Lulled by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, Darren decided to take a nap in order to rest up before the upcoming forum. But as soon as the man closed his eyes, he immediately heard loud screams coming from the other end of the car. "Doctor, is there a doctor on board? There's a woman giving birth here," one of the passengers screamed. "Well, I guess I was right," Darren said with a sigh, forgetting all about his nap. Darren headed for the woman surrounded by the crowd. "Don't worry, I'm a doctor," Darren explained, catching the conductor's anxious look. Since the young woman's waters had already broken, he needed to deliver the baby right there and then. Darren asked the conductor to notify the driver to stop the train at the next station and call ahead to make sure the ambulance would be waiting for them upon arrival. Trying to calm the woman down, Darren set to work. The experienced obstetrician acted deftly and confidently, which immediately won the trust of the young woman. To Darren's surprise, everything went great, and the delivery was much easier than he expected. The young woman turned out to be very smart and readily followed his instructions. Soon, a tiny, rosy-cheeked baby was already crying in Darren's arms. "Here, you gave birth to a real hero here." Having examined the baby, Darren calmed down a bit. The boy seemed perfectly healthy, except that he had a large birthmark on his chest. At first, Darren mistook it for biological secretions, but after looking more closely, he realized that it wasn't the case. At that point, Darren felt uneasy. The doctor's anxiety was explained by the fact that the boy had exactly the same birthmark on his chest as he did. Genetics is an amazing thing. Darren knew that such coincidences simply didn't happen in life. A little later, the doctor learned that the woman's name was Nicole. But when Darren learned her maiden name, the man felt even more uncomfortable. "Nicole Hughes? Lord, is that even possible?" flashed through the doctor's head. In order to get to the bottom of things, Darren asked the woman about her mother. "Oh, she's a nurse. She works at the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Her name is Sandy Hughes," Nicole said. It was only then that Darren realized that he just delivered the grandchild of the same Sandy, whom he'd been close to over 20 years ago. Perhaps it was all just one huge coincidence, but Darren could feel that it wasn't the case. Soon, the train stopped at the station, and the woman was taken by the ambulance called by the conductor. Before she left, Darren managed to get Nicole's mother's phone number. As it turned out, Sandy Hughes never married Peter and lived alone all her life, raising her daughter Nicole. With a fluttering heart, Darren called her number. Sandy didn't recognize the stranger's voice at first, but when Darren told her that he remembered what happened 20 years ago, the woman gasped in surprise. "Darren, it's great to hear from you. Listen, we need to meet. I have so much to tell you," Sandy started saying, but the man wasn't worried about it. "I have a daughter, don't I?" "I already know that," Darren said with tears in his eyes. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, after which Sandy confirmed Darren's suspicions. Nicole really was his daughter. 20 years ago, when they were intimate, Sandy couldn't have even suspected that she would get pregnant. After Peter attacked the young doctor, Sandy broke up with him once and for all. All this time, she lived with the thought that Darren would return one day and find out that he had a daughter. Of course, Darren didn't get to the medical forum that day. Instead, the doctor went to see Sandy, who had been waiting for him for 20 years. Their meeting was very emotional and didn't leave anyone indifferent. About a week later, Nicole was released from the hospital, and she was immediately told that Darren was her father. That birthmark wasn't passed on to Darren's daughter, but it was inherited by his grandson. Thus, by the will of fate, the man delivered his own grandchild, having no idea who he was at the time. Later, Darren was back at the same hospital where he used to work with Sandy. Now they could work side by side and do everything to make the residents of the town happy and healthy. Moreover, helping babysit his grandson, Darren sincerely believed that becoming a grandparent was the best thing that could have happened in his life.